All right, looks like we're now live, and there's a ton of questions lined up for me already in the chat. So I'm going to jump right in. I'll take Aaron's question first. Aaron was nice enough to tweet out that the session was going to be happening. You said one shouldn't assume Heraclitus's logos is the logos of John. That's the Gospel of John, chapter 1. What is a good approach to learn about logos in Greco-Roman culture? So that's a good question. And I would say the first thing to learn is that logos has about 20 different meanings. So it's not a univocal term. It's not even an analogical term. It is definitely a cluster of different connected terms, and it can mean everything from speech and the faculty of speech to reason, to lie, to account, to story, to reasoning, and all sorts of other things in between. I would say that you always want to be super careful, and not just with logos, with really any philosophical term of importance, not to automatically conflate, what one author is using with that term with what another author is using. Great example of this would be Plato and Aristotle and Homer with the word thumos. One of the words that people who know me see me use a lot. It's that spirited part of ourselves in Plato, or it's that part of ourselves in the chest that gets riled up in Homer, or it's a type of desire, a type of erexis in Aristotle. You don't want to blur all of these together. So, logos is going to show up in Plato, in Aristotle, in the Stoics, in the Epicureans, and you notice where this is going, in everybody. Right? And so you want to look at individual thinkers and what they actually make of that particular term within the context of their works. And then you can start comparing and contrasting to other thinkers and saying, like, okay, so Heraclitus is using it to mean this, pervasive thing, perhaps, that governs everything or encompasses everything. The Stoics are kind of doing that. Is it exactly the same? We don't have enough of Heraclitus to actually know. And so, those are some, ways you can do it. When it comes to looking at, biblical scriptures, clearly whoever was writing the Gospel of John had something in mind that was kind of like what the Hellenistic philosophers were talking about, but not exactly the same. You're more likely to find a philosophical use of it in, say, the Book of the Wisdom of Solomon, which is considered apocryphal by most Protestants, but all the earlier Christian churches accept it as canonical. So, all right, let me take another one. Galen says, are there any good resources on Nietzsche as classicist or philologist, what his degree was actually in, or people who write in that area? Google Nietzsche and language, and you should find some resources. It's not as if there's a lot of people out there doing philology today. Nowadays, we call them classicists or linguists, or, the discipline itself has changed. But there's so much secondary literature out there on Nietzsche that it shouldn't be difficult to find stuff that deals with Nietzsche. And if what you're interested in is his biography, there's a lot of sources on that. I don't actually use much of that, and it's been so long since I've looked into anything like that. I haven't read anything really biographical about him other than mentioning a few things here and there since grad school. So. Colamus, here's this could be an entire session, this question. Are there any thinkers you think are well known for the wrong thing? For example, a philosopher who's well known for one idea, who has a lot more interesting ideas, that sort of thing. Sure, like René Descartes, right? René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Walking into a bar, I don't think is actually a mode of thinking from a Cartesian perspective, so you don't disappear. There's way more to Descartes than just Cartesian dualism between mind and body. There's all sorts of really interesting stuff in his works, particularly as he gets older and engages with people like Princess Elizabeth. There's a lot of quotes from Hegel that are totally taken out of context that, for example, spirit is a bone. No, it's not. That's the whole point of the phrenology section. Spirit is not a bone. Hegel is talking about the rum-dums who think that it is and who are getting it wrong. And then people think that's Hegel's position. Or, Wittgenstein, meaning is use. Yeah, that's an insight in Wittgenstein's philosophy, but it's not the totality of it. And I mean, we could go on and on and on about philosophers who are misunderstood. I'll just bring up one other one. Socrates is that guy who said that he doesn't know anything, and that's why he's so wise. Well, yes, he does say that in a few places. And then throughout the rest of the dialogues, you'll constantly see him saying, well, as we know, don't you agree, so-and-so? And they'll say yes. And that means that he actually does know a lot of stuff. So yeah, that's a big problem. And, where does it come from? People who like their philosophy in little bite-sized chunks, who don't read actual texts and rely upon other people's essentially pre-digested, bits of ideas, which could be right or could be wrong. I mean, sometimes quotes on the internet actually are by the people who said them. Sometimes they're not. There's a lot of not Plato, not Aristotle, not Epictetus, not Marcus Aurelius quotes floating around out there. But unless you actually know the philosopher, you can't tell the bullshit from the genuine article, right? Giovanni says, what does Nietzsche mean by plastic sciences? And besides undermining religion, how does his view of science relate to the overman? Two totally unrelated issues. Plastic sciences, plastic, in earlier stuff before we had plastic just means, things that are malleable. And he might actually, I don't know what thing you're referring to exactly, but he might be talking about the plastic arts in, for example, the birth of tragedy, which would be sculpture, for example, right? Where you're working with materials. Undermining religion, how does his view of science relate to the overman? It doesn't relate to it directly. I mean, these are different concepts. Nietzsche thinks that the advancement of science in, particularly the 18th and 19th centuries has reached the point where science itself as a worldview has been essentially undermined by science itself. This is part of what makes Nietzsche a prescient thinker for our times. Not only has science gotten to the point where most scientists don't really understand much outside of their particular field, but if we consider the theorization and advancement of science in a careful way, not in an ideological way, not in a positivist way, we can see that there's a lot that doesn't fit, and we just accept it almost like a substitute for religion. And Nietzsche, if you think about the genealogy of morals, you've got the priest figure, then you got the philosopher, and then you've got who? The man of science, who is equally committed to a faith perspective that he desperately needs in order for there to be meaning in the universe. But to be more honest about things would mean understanding that science doesn't give us meaning. At best, it culminates in technology and often tends to be sort of a corrosive effect on things. But there's many different kinds of science. Wissenschaft in German means everything. A better translation for it is not science, with the big S, but rather disciplinary knowledge, sort of like episteme in Greek. God, what is your opinion of Wittgenstein's philosophy? I think Wittgenstein is pretty overrated. I think he would have been better off. He would have been a better philosopher because he did have a lot of talent had he read much more widely. I said this in my video about my Wittgensteinian phase. His early stuff that leads to the Tractatus, interesting, trivial in many respects. He himself gets past that, introduces ideas that were useful at the time because analytic philosophy had thrown out so much baby with the bathwater when it came to philosophy. Notions like language game are cool and interesting, but ultimately not adequately developed in Wittgenstein's own work. So, Igor, have you ever got into a dialogue with someone from Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon background? Yeah, sure. I mean, I've had some Mormon friends. I've actually had some Jehovah's Witnesses friends, but they were all lapsed Jehovah's Witnesses, and many of them were actually quite angry about their childhood and missing out on holidays and things like that with their friends. But if you're talking about the missionaries who are going around trying to convert people, I don't talk with them because I have nothing. They're coming from such a the Jehovah's Witnesses from such a weird, quirky background with their particular biblical reading. I'm not interested in it. I don't engage fundamentalists either. I don't. My time is better spent on other things. Latter-day Saints, it depends. If they're going to get real preachy at me, I don't have any interest in that. They're not going to convert me. But I've engaged in ecumenical dialogue with some friends who are Latter-day Saints. Damn it, Albert says, who are your favorite philosophers that deal with ephemerality and things fading, permanence versus change? Well, that's interesting. I mean, Hegel I'm pointing over there because the phenomenology is sitting there, is dealing with trying to understand change. Metaphysics itself is trying to understand the nature of change. It's one of the central topics already in Heraclitus and Parmenides, and then Plato, and going through Aristotle and all the great thinkers of antiquity in the medieval period. But I'm not really that focused on those sort of topics. I guess you could say I'm more focused on what Heidegger calls finitude, which is, thinking about, you could talk about it in terms of ephemerality, but it doesn't mean everything has to be ephemeral, like going away. Ephemeron means of a day, and that's something that was often used to talk about mortals in Greek poetry. The gods would say that we are ephemeroi, we're of just a day. Pindar actually has this great poem of which I only remember that, aner skios, what is it? We're the dream of a shadow, I don't know. I don't really have a lot of people that I would say are focused thematically on that, but it comes up quite a bit. I mean, Rilke is somebody who figures heavily into my thinking as a poet, but also as a letter writer who reflects on these things. All right, Carlbad, what works of philosophy did you read to achieve such an unassailable hairline, and can this power be learned? It's all genetics, I'm afraid, and probably has a little bit to do with diet. I don't know. I lucked out, and if you look at my bio dad, he's got his hair, and we all, my bio half sister, I saw her recently and she had her head shaved on the sides. She's just a few years younger than me. And we had a long conversation where she was like, yeah, I got to keep it shaved because it just gets too damn hot. There's so much hair there. So I guess we're all kind of blessed with that. I keep it pulled back because otherwise it gets pretty unruly pretty quickly. You can see that it's all kind of popping out as it is. We just lucked out. There's nothing you can do in terms of philosophy. Being bald or balding doesn't make you any less of a philosopher than having hair. Look at Socrates, right? Who else was bald? Socrates to Foucault, we could say. So I actually, a long time ago, I used to keep my head shaved because the very first time that I did it, I was like, wow, that's comfortable, And then I just did that for about, I don't know, more than 10 years. And I had a clippers and I just, shave it every so often, save myself so much money on haircuts. And And then I just started letting it grow. And then, I was lucky enough to have a fiance who became my wife, who really liked long hair. And I just kept growing it out. So, all right. Sam, do you think proficiency in math is especially good for developing general critical thinking skills? No, I think it's a thing that would be helpful for that. There's a lot of people who are disabled by thinking that everything can be treated as mathematics or logic when it doesn't work that way with human beings. Once you get into culture, it's a lot more complicated. But mathematics is good to learn and work through. There is something that you're getting. I mean, there is a part of critical thinking that mathematics is absolutely essential to. That's what we call numeracy, like understanding how statistics work and what to look for in the studies when people quote things. But there's so much more to critical thinking than just mathematics. So I don't know, that would help. There's Mark. How are you? I'm doing good. How do you think Plato's Socrates makes a good exemplar for participation in the public sphere? Does this make him a pedagogical figure? Yeah, people often talk about Socrates as doing philosophy in the marketplace. And that is indeed one place where he does it. And he also does it in the law courts. And he also does it in people's houses, like going to Gorgias's house and kind of pissing off his host there, or going to the house of Agathon for the symposium. And he also does it in beautiful groves, sometimes a little bit outside the city, like in the Phaedra. So he does it in a whole bunch of different locations, but you could say that his philosophy is public and in a dual way. One way is that the character Socrates is presented as like engaging with whoever he's got in front of him. He's not setting up scenarios ahead of time saying, I'm only going to talk with these people, or I'll give a talk and it will run exactly 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A or anything like that. He's doing things in a public way that exposes him to sometimes ridicule or opposition or death threats or misunderstandings. And Plato is writing these dialogues down and putting them, you could say, into a public domain, not a legal public domain, obviously, because that didn't exist back then, but putting them out there for everybody in his own time and following who wants to access them and figure out what to make of Socrates and the topics that they are discussing. So is Socrates a good exemplar? This is a really interesting question, because Aristotle, who is incredibly attentive to the potential for philosophy to be public. That's why he writes the book, The Art of Rhetoric, and argues that all teaching and learning involves persuasion in some way. Aristotle actually didn't like Socrates' irony that much. He considers it a kind of, affectation, right? Other people have, think about Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard picks up on the fact that Socrates can give us like two messages at once with the same thing, and sort of public consumption, superficial message, and then something that we have to do a bit more work to engage with. And, who's right, Kierkegaard or Aristotle? Well, they're both right. I mean, Socrates is kind of a humbug in some places. Oh, I don't know anything about this. Can you teach me? Sometimes you almost have to roll your eyes at that guy. But there is a lot of interesting stuff to continually explore there. And so you can do philosophy in a public way without demanding like the entire public get everything that you're doing, and without veering off into Leo Strauss esotericism land, which is sometimes popular among people as well. Online person, thoughts on the work of Marcel Proust in memory. I'm not a good person to ask about Proust because I did my obligatory reading one book, and then I was like, I'm never wasting my time on this again. There's a lot of high literature that I'm just not into. And I sort of unapologetically will say, if you want to read Proust, more power to you, but I'm not into it. I'm also not into James Joyce. I'm not into a lot of contemporary authors. I just, I don't want to I don't want to waste my time on time past if it's somebody else's time past and they're presenting it in the way that Proust is. So Thus Spoke Films. What do you think of Moby Dick, and could studying literature be a good introduction to philosophy? So let me take the second question first. Yes, studying literature can be a great introduction to philosophy, provided the literature is itself philosophical. So, reading the latest Oprah's book recommendation, probably not going to be that good. Reading the stuff that's like on the New York Times bestsellers where it's mostly hype, and it often tends to be beach books for the lowest common denominator, probably not going to lead you to philosophy, even if they mention and get wrong a couple philosophers. The most glaring example of that would be Mark Levin with criticizing the Franklin School. I mean, if you read something like that, first of all, you're going to get total bullshit on Levin's part, because he's a right-wing nut job, and he's got his shtick, and he's got to stick to it. And he's going to have done a minimal of reading. He'll probably have outsourced it to somebody else, but he can't even get the name right. And nobody actually could catch that error, because they were all too stupid and ignorant to find it. So that tells you a lot, right? But if you're reading Borges, okay, now you're going to get introduced to philosophy, because he's going to talk about philosophers, and there's going to be philosophical themes. If you're reading Ursula K. Le Guin, you're going to definitely get introduced to philosophical themes, although she's not going to name them as such, except in a few books. If you're reading Dostoevsky, the characters are going to argue back and forth about philosophy, some of them getting it right, some of them getting it wrong. And so you can learn a lot of philosophy through literature. Philip K. Dick is a big favorite of mine for that reason. Moby Dick, well worth reading. And this is one of those things where somebody might be like, well, you don't like Proust, but you like Melville. Yeah, we got different tastes. I'm willing to suffer through the chapters that seem a little bit interminable in that, and I'm not willing to do that for Proust, because a lot of it is taste and temperament. So I would read it, see if you like it, and if you don't like it, maybe you go back to it later on. Making high schoolers read it, I don't know that that's a great rite of passage. All right, online person. Thoughts on, no, we already did that one. Oops, just skipped a little bit. Let me roll it back up here. Boy, we got a lot of questions here. Hopefully I can get to most of them. Igor, if you could use a time machine for 3 random common history events, what would you like to witness? Wow, that's interesting. I mean, I would say like going back in time and like seeing important events that have to do with like intellectual history, but I probably wouldn't understand most of what's being said, because, I can read Latin, but I can't like hear Latin and figure out what people are saying, So like going back and hearing Cicero give a particular speech, that wouldn't do me any good. I'd need like an interpreter. And I think if you had asked earlier me, probably I would have liked some great battles or something like that. I think probably now, if I had a machine like that, maybe I'd go back in time. This is going to sound really silly, but I'd go back in time and I'd do one of two things. I'd go see concerts with bands that I could never get to see in their heyday. Like I never did see Ronnie James Dio, and so like on the Holy Diver tour, go to a show, or things like that. But I could also see going back and talking to some of my relatives. Like, it'd be interesting to, and I probably could carry this out, because my French is not that rusty. Talk to my great-great-grandfather on my adoptive mom's side and see him sign up for the Civil War, or muster out, that's how my family got here in the first place, or, things like that. Maybe go back further in time and talk to Pierre Lefebvre, the guy who became the first Le Marais that my family on that side is named after. Merisier, cherry trees, wild cherries. And so he planted them around his boundaries, and he became Pierre Lefebvre Smith, right? Peter Smith, de Le Marais, called the cherry tree guy. Rob Wickline, have you done any reading in the anarchist tradition? Yeah, a little bit, but I wouldn't call myself an expert on it. I would like to read more, for example, Godwin, in part because I want to fill in some gaps having to do with the person who I really like, who he married, Mary Wollstonecraft. All right. I'm going to ridicule. Are you aware of the anthropologist David Graeber? No. Subcum freak, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is Heidegger's Greek read really? It's not bad. I don't know why people say that. Useless projects, would you call yourself a Stoic? If not, what point of thinking do you disagree on? Well, I wouldn't call myself a Stoic with lowercase s, because there is a huge, huge difference between lowercase s Stoic, which is just a temperament, the stiff upper lip bullshit, and then actual uppercase s Stoic, meaning a follower of the Stoic philosophy. And I'll put it to you this way. So I'm not an orthodox Stoic. I'm a Ciceronian eclectic, which means that I draw from multiple traditions and try to take the best of them and bring them together. And I would say that I probably know more, and this is going to sound a little bit, vain, but it doesn't, it's basically reality. I probably know more about Stoic philosophy and practice more of it than most of the people out there who are like beginner to intermediate, who are calling themselves Stoics or billing themselves as like Stoic coaches, just because I've been studying it for years and years and involved in the movement. And, Stoicism is a major source for the work that I do. But I also draw on Aristotelianism and Platonism and some Christian philosophy and existentialism and dialectical philosophy. So I bring them all together. I've often said, just for an example of the things that you're asking about, I'm sort of in between the Stoics and the Aristotelians when it comes to anger. I don't believe that all anger is bad, but I think that most anger is bad. So, let's see. Rob Wickline, does Heidegger ever render Aletheia into a German term? I see him use conceal and unconcealment a lot, but he retains Aletheia in the Greek often as well. Well, the concealment and unconcealment would be German terms, right? Because they're being translated from German. When he talks about Aletheia as truth, it's going to be Wahrheit, right? Or das Wahre. Nguyen, how do you distinguish between studying and practicing philosophy? Well, if you look at Pierre Hadot's chapter on spiritual practices, studying is a form of practice if it's done right. So it's not like there's a rigid division line between them. One is more focused on application. One is more focused on storing up the stuff in your mind and reflecting on it. But very often there's a dialectic between the two, because when you put things into practice, you get to see what the ideas really translate into. So roughly, Bumble, has there ever been a philosopher who's viewed the human condition as dismally tragicomic, like crying until you start laughing? Do you have any thoughts on this? Yeah, Lev Shestov talks about how he's not a fan of Spinoza to begin with, and he thinks that Spinoza really went wrong in thinking that philosophy should remove us from laughter and crying, and that these responses are really quite important. So you read around in his works and you'll get a good basis for that, I would say. Some of Dostoevsky's characters, some of them burst into tears quite easily, right? I think you would probably find more people in the existentialist tradition. Nietzsche doesn't talk about that so much in The Birth of Tragedy, but I would say that his idea of there being noble responses to the problem of life and the way that he figures the problem of life is essentially like, the problem of nihilism. Maybe that would be one of the places to look at as well. All right. Monkey Enjoyer, my intro to philosophy teacher told us that continental philosophy doesn't have metaphysics. I know this is wrong, but why do analytically trained teachers think this to be true? I don't know. I mean, that's a really crazy one to say, and I would expect that it's probably either they are so poorly read in continental philosophy that they've never encountered somebody like, say, Heidegger or Hegel or Gabriel Marcel, who talks about the ontological mystery, or they are using metaphysics. You could call it metaphysics asterisk, meaning they don't have something like analytic metaphysics, which itself would also be wrong, because even the rather anemic thing that analytics call metaphysics has its correlates in continental philosophy. So, I mean, it could just be ignorance. It could be being antagonistic to continental philosophy. But that's kind of a weird one. Giga Chad Mesh, in what ways can philosophy illuminate speculative fiction? So that's a great question. So that I need to actually someday sit down and write something about, because I'll just sort of run through, like, in bullet points, what we have. There'll be speculative fiction that deliberately incorporates philosophy, right? And that could be like Borges is a great example, or Philip K. Dick, right? Where the characters are deliberately looking at philosophy. I mean, do we want to consider Dostoevsky speculative fiction? Maybe not, maybe so. And then there'll be like stuff where they're not directly mentioning philosophy, but it's clear what they're drawing on. Like you can say, oh, they're getting this idea from this person, and then knowing the philosophy can help you unpack that. There's other cases too where maybe the author didn't really deliberately do that, but you can say, oh, this is really illuminating this philosophy stuff is illuminating the speculative fiction side. So, like, Robert Howard is Conan, a Nietzschean hero, one of the themes we explored in the Robert Howard Conan session a long time ago. And I think you could ask a similar question about, like, Cain in Karl Edward Wagner's novels, right? You can look at Ian Banks' Culture series and say, what's going on here? Are human beings in the culture really happy or not? And you could look at it from a utilitarian perspective, or you could look at it from other perspectives as well. So that's another way that knowing philosophy can help you illuminate speculative fiction. So I think those are the kind of big starting points. But there's probably more to say. Bruce Moore, hello. Nice to see you here, Bruce. Always good to see you. Glad that the hurricane didn't devastate Texas, but unhappy that it devastated the other places. All right. Johann 96 Erlandson, what does Gabriel Marcel mean in Existence and Human Freedom when he says that existentialism is developed historically from the Hegelian system? Well, Kierkegaard, who Marcel looks back to. Also, you should remember, too, that Marcel himself did work on Josiah Royce, who was himself an American Hegelian idealist. So, Marcel thinks that Hegelianism, which is not confined just to Hegel, but was, wide movement all over the place, which had a significant presence in France, in Germany, and England, and in the United States. Hegelianism was, kind of good in some respects, but also tended to shift focus away from the existential, the individual, the concrete person, except if in terms of world historical individuals. And the existentialists really wanted to return to that. And they also thought that this insistence on there being like a system that covers everything, maybe that was too optimistic. Even if you're a left Hegelian and you got like the system is in process, right? Maybe that's still too optimistic about reality and the human mind and our capacities to understand it through experience and language and things like that. So, and historically, before existentialists are re-embracing Hegel, like, parts of Hegel, like Sartre and de Beauvoir they're rejecting Hegel. They're reacting against Hegel. So I would say that's part of it as well. All right. Our brain hurts a lot. Are you watching the new Dune film? I might watch it. I've got a lot of stuff on the docket right now. But yeah, we'll probably watch it. When I say we, I mean me and my wife, Andy. But we're both pretty busy people. So right now we tend to spend more time watching TV shows than the full commit to 2 hours, sit down with popcorn movies, But I should see it. Yeah. Matthew Clark Ventures, I'm just about to start an undergraduate degree in philosophy. What advice do you have for me? I mean, I don't have any advice that would like be across the board applicable because every place is different. And, philosophy is one of those fields where you can have the same intro class and it's going to be taught even in the same place very differently by different teachers. I guess one of the things I could say is without being cynical or dismissive, if you're like, for example, the earlier question about my intro to philosophy teacher tells me this, don't take everything they say as gospel because they could be full of crap, or they could be joking around with you. You don't really know, or they could just be uninformed or ideologues or something like that. And worry more before you go on and like criticize or, raise your hand to make objections. Make sure you understand what's being said. That's understanding is more important. When you go to write papers, one of the common things I often tell people is, okay, if you're going to present a position, consider counterpositions and then say why they're partially right and partially wrong. That will help to show people that it's sort of like showing your work in mathematics, right? Well, this is why I accept this position rather than just stick to one position and follow through with it. S. Chavoshi, would I consider working and making videos on Hegel's philosophy of right? It would be great. Yeah, maybe. It would have to be crowdfunded like the half-hour Hegel phenomenology thing is. I think I would be more inclined to do philosophy of right than try to tackle the science of logic, which somebody else is already doing anyway, but not exactly with the half-hour thing that I'm doing. There's other things I want to do before I would go back to Hegel. I've done Epictetus's Enchiridion in a half-hour format like that, close reading every single line, every single chapter. I would like to do Descartes' Meditations and the replies like that. I would like to do St. Anselm's Proslogion. So those are, shorter works. And then I think I would go back to another big book, right? But I don't know that it would necessarily be Hegel right away. I mean, it might be interesting to do Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I'm a little bit leery of doing this because it would be a lot of work, but Heidegger's Being in Time, or Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation. But first I got to get the half-hour Hegel phenomenology done. Rob Wickline, is the phenomenology of spirit any easier in the German? I don't know. It depends on what your reading is like. It's not as if there's a rating system for this sort of thing and there's automatically easier or more difficult or stuff like that. I mean, you can know what Hegel's actually writing if you can read the German, but Hegel's not a good writer. So it's, I'll put it to you this way. It's not like reading Nietzsche in the German, where Nietzsche's a great stylist. Schopenhauer is too. Hegel is just, an unclear writer. And so, I mean, you can say, well, now I actually know what the German is, but I don't think it's easier in any real respect. Abe Radolph says, what do you think of Ehrman's mathematical refutation on Hume's essay on miracles? Never read it. James Carlyle, is the Philosophical Gourmet a good resource for prospective grad students? Really nothing that comes from Stephen Leiter is a good source for anything, quite frankly. He's like an old crank, and he's always been kind of a uncritical elitist, and the Philosophical Gourmet has been garbage in terms of like actual quality, right? It's basically like a elitist popularity contest of his buddies and whoever he wanted to bring in. It's never been a reliable guide to the quality of academic departments. But so that said, I mean, if you like that sort of thing, if you're into like, the equivalent of American Idol and the judges for music, then yeah, sure, read the Philosophical Gourmet. I mean, it is helpful to know what Stephen Leiter and his ilk think is important, right? I mean, it's the same thing like rating journals, this is a top-rated journal. Says who? I mean, there's no consensus across the board in the world of philosophy. And Leiter has been notoriously bad on dinging some departments for like if you're a pluralistic department, you're going to get scored way, way lower, right? And if you're somebody who, hangs out with him and kisses his ass, well, then your department's going to be higher. So, no, I wouldn't rely on it. All right. This is a follow-up from Subcom Freak. I would also watch a lecture series on philosophy of right, so I don't have to read Hegel. Well, that's wrong, right? You have to read the Hegel. The lecture series are not a substitute for that, and you're not going to get very much out of them compared to actually reading the text and then going to the lecture series. And that goes for all the videos that I do. If I do a video on Aristotle's metaphysics, it's not a substitute for reading the metaphysics. How do you know that I'm getting the stuff right, if you don't actually read it? Adam Titor, who's the funniest philosopher to you? Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of funny philosophers, frankly. I can tell you that, like, in person, Alistair McIntyre, pretty dry wit, and also like from hanging out in person, and spending probably more time with him. My friend and colleague John Sellers is a pretty funny guy too. Over at University College London, we've probably chatted more online than we have face to face, but yeah, he's a funny guy. I don't know. That's what I'd have to think about. I will say this: I do have a old grad school friend and colleague, Philip Dean, who, if you just Google his name, Philip Deen, one of his specializations is philosophy of humor and comedy, and he is a darkly funny guy. I haven't seen him for about 5 years. I have to catch up with him, I suppose. But he's a incisive person when it comes to that. All right, let's see. I'm going to see if I can take some more that haven't already said something. My enemy, who was the last person you met who you thought was much smarter than you? Much smarter, I don't know. I haven't had that impression for a while, but smarter, because, intelligence is very relative to areas. It's not as if IQ measures anything that really matters, and there's all sorts of intangibles. I'll say this, when it comes to knowing and understanding and having thought about the philosophies that I'm particularly interested in, when I get to hang out with like Chris Gill and interview him, he's smarter than me when it comes to that sort of stuff. When it comes to technology, I understand how to use it better than he does, but I kind of value the understanding, like the great, movements in Hellenistic philosophy and what led to what is a little bit more important than being able to use Zoom or things like that. But I don't know. I mean, there's quite a few people that I've gotten to meet that I think are smarter than me in, their areas. It's not something I really think about much, I don't worry about like rating and that sort of stuff. All right. Made of Clay. I was wondering if you know any books that speak in a good way on how to deal with mental illnesses, specifically anxiety. I mean, there's the old cognitive behavior therapy stuff like Burns is Feeling Good, if you're into that sort of thing. I mean, anxiety is a theme that's explored by many philosophers from Epictetus to Kierkegaard to Heidegger to Jaspers and onward. I mean, there's lots and lots of stuff out there. I mean, there's nothing that like jumps out at me where I'm like, yeah, that's the definitive work that's gonna help you deal with it. And there's different kinds of anxiety too, right? So here's a question that I don't have any idea about. For a bright future, is Hans Heinz Holtz's ontology theory known in analytic philosophy? How the hell would I know? I'm not an analytic philosopher. I don't even claim to like have a toe in all the areas in continental philosophy, and I've never heard of Hans Heinz Holtz. So, Josh, do you see the historical progression of German idealism as a successful philosophical development? Depends on what you mean by successful. I mean, they managed to publish books, they managed to cognize areas of reality. They managed to make contributions to philosophy. So I guess that counts as successful. I find reading Kant very interesting. It's been a long time since I read Fichte or Schelling. I didn't find either of them particularly compelling. Obviously, I enjoy Hegel, although I'm not a Hegelian. So, and there's other German idealists as well. There's like a whole swarm of those people, including people like Schopenhauer, right? Who's also very interesting. All right. Okay, so here's a question from William. How do I tell my adult daughters that they should stop calling and texting me all the time without being rude? I don't want to hurt their feelings. So you're probably going to hurt their feelings no matter what, because if you just kind of like suck it up and let them keep texting you constantly, you're going to eventually get to the point where you're like, knock it off, this is bullshit, or something like that. And then you'll wish that you'd taken a different approach before. And, you don't have to like impose a complete moratorium on them. I think that, laying down limits with people is important, particularly as a parent, with adult life. Usually it's the opposite problem where your kids just like, they just disappear and you're like, hey, are you still there? You want to talk about stuff? Okay. And you don't get all that much while they're high schoolers, college kids, because they're exploring this, cool world that you don't actually know anything about, even though you went through the stuff yourself, right? But too many texts, I would just say, listen, I love you, but I don't want to be texted all the time. I appreciate the closeness, but I got stuff to do, and you can do that in a way without being rude, I think. So, yeah. Now, here's an interesting one from Straubel. What does conservatism mean to you, and why do you say Republicans, so that'd be American Republicans, are not following conservative values? Because they aren't, and there's sort of a meta-conservatism we can talk about. Conserving means hanging on to something, not shifting it around and changing it in the matter of a couple decades. So let's think about what conservatives were for and against back in the 1970s and 1980s. Gun control, right? Before they all became whores for the NRA, conservatives actually wanted gun control. And the NRA actually started out as kind of a not a completely sane organization, but a lot more than they are today. And now the Republicans think that it's important to have guns everywhere, and it's the answer to school shootings is just arm the teachers, and we don't want to alarm the gun manufacturers or anything like that by imposing fines on them. Being for some sort of common good as opposed to crony capitalism, which isn't even like laissez-faire capitalism. It's more like let's get in bed with our buddies capitalism. That's what Republicans are for the most part these days. Some of them may lie and say that they're for genuine capitalism or something like that, but they're not. Look at their practice, right? Look at who lobbies them, and you can criticize Democrats for similar stuff, but we're talking about Republicans here. The environment, conservatism used to mean conserving the environment, not just strip mining it and outsourcing environmental catastrophe to everybody else and denying that climate change is existing. And again, being whores to the oil industry. So, where are present day Republicans? Think about COVID, right? This masking and vaccine and stuff like that. If Ronald Reagan were around today, the person that they claim to idolize, he would look at these nut jobs, who are now the core, these MAGA people of the Republican Party, and he'd be like, wow, you people, you're something totally different. You're like these crazy John Birchers, the lunatic fringe. How did you capture the Republican Party? And that's the condition that we're in. We have a party that's largely ineffective, somewhat do-gooders, but often themselves, in the pockets of industry and their own special interests. And then we've got a nut job party, a can't trust them on anything party, will just screw things up for the sake of screwing things up party. That's the contemporary Republicans. And there are some exceptions, but they're completely powerless. And some of them are, pretty mean, miserable people themselves. Look at Liz Cheney. I wouldn't want to walk down a dark alley with her. And yet she's not good enough for the whack jobs that are now running the party. So that's probably enough of that. Let's see here. Marco says, do you know any political philosophy books that can help me better understand today's politics? Yeah, I mean, there isn't anything that's like a blueprint for understanding things. It's better to like read widely across the spectrum so you have a good sense of like what different ideologies are and how things transform over time. Going to the conservative question, if you want to understand what conservatism was like before, you could read works in the conservative tradition, like read Russell Kirk, or read more contemporary stuff and see whether what's happening now actually fits into that. Nowadays, you definitely would want to read stuff about fascism because the Republicans, many of them, and the people who ally with them in different respects, quite a few of them are arguably fascist or proto-fascist. So there's a great literature out there from the 20th century going into the 21st century about that. I mean, you definitely need to understand how the lobbying system works in order to understand our current problems. And you also want to understand that we don't actually have, when it comes to so many things that are political, we don't have a system. We have a patchwork of many, many systems, which makes it very difficult to fix things in education, in healthcare, in policing, in criminal justice. We have so many things on the local level that we can't effectively reform them because, we fix things here and then all the bad guys go right down the road to the next county, All right. Hodika, how did Plato tackle the idea man is the measure of all things? Well, as it just so happens, there is a dialogue called the Protagoras, right? So you might take a look at that. Plato said that man is not the measure of all things. Instead, the forms are the measure and source and, intelligibility and causality giver of all things. And we human beings can more or less participate in that. I mean, you could look at Republic Book 6, where there's the discussion of the divided line, the relativism of being the measure of all things. That would apply to perception and physical objects, but it sure doesn't apply to mathematics or to the other forms, right? Jaden Patrick, what's your opinion on idealism as philosophy compared to materialism? I don't have opinions on big isms like that compared to each other because who's materialism, who's idealism? There's a lot of different instances of those. David, thank you for the videos. I'm last year's philosophy student, and your videos helped a lot. That's great. Yeah. Darth Vader, do you agree with Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates? If not, then why? I agree with parts of it. I think Nietzsche was, he was engaging in a lot of basically tearing Socrates down. Nietzsche really doesn't like Socrates, Plato, what he thinks that they inspired. I won't say what they did, but what they inspired in Western metaphysics. And I think he's unduly harsh. I don't really buy into Nietzsche's attempt to reduce philosophy often to biography and drives that Nietzsche is so smart that he can identify and none of us saw before him. So yeah, that's probably enough. Darth Vader asks, why haven't you done videos on Kant's transcendental idealism? Well, because I haven't gotten to him. I got a lot of other stuff to do. How many other philosophers are there out there who are worth doing things on? Hundreds. And who do I shoot videos on most often? Well, the people who I am teaching classes on. I don't generally teach Kant's transcendental idealism. I teach Kant's moral philosophy instead because it's a little bit more accessible for my students. But I'll put it to you this way. If you want to see videos on anything in particular, feel free to write me about my rate sheets for commissioned videos. People who really, really, really want videos on a particular thing, they put their money where their mouth is. And I've done commissioned videos on Nietzsche, on Heidegger, on other thinkers as well. But I do what I'm going to do, and it's not as if Kant is at the very top of the list. I have so many other people to get to before, like doing the prolegomena, right? Julian says, aren't you skeptical of the extremely rapid progress of physics and its detaching from philosophy and more mathematical nature in the 20th century? I don't know what it would mean to be skeptical of the rapid progress of physics. Physics is not unusual in detaching itself from philosophy. Philosophy has been the generator of nearly all of the sciences other than mathematics. I mean, chemistry was, you could say alchemy played into that as well. But natural philosophy spun off all these other areas. Medicine was more or less independent in origins, although intimately connected with philosophy for a long time. And then the social sciences. I don't see why we should be skeptical of physics per se. We might be skeptical of claims made by particular physicists, especially when they stray into philosophy, like Stephen Hawking, right? Who makes all sorts of claims about what people ought to believe. And I think, once he gets out of the realm of physics, he's basically full of crap, and poorly educated. But, we could say that about anybody in most fields, right? If you're, if you're a sociologist, you might not actually know that much about aesthetics, right? So yeah. Let's see here. Some back and forth discussion going on about hair. Noah says, an advice question. I'm a senior and writing my senior assignment this semester. Is it a bad idea to make my thesis something concerning Hegel and or Deleuze? So that's a good question. My immediate inclination is to say probably yeah. But it really depends on a couple factors. So one of them would be you want to sound out your teacher on this, right? Because they're the one who's going to be grading your thing. You're not writing your masterpiece. You're not writing your dissertation for your PhD. You're writing a paper to get through things. And so it doesn't have to be the greatest thing in the world. It just has to be, interesting and have spent some time and show evidence of thinking things through. So if your teacher is cool with you talking about Hegel and Deleuze and you feel that you're up to it, and you don't have to be, some scholar who's mastered the stuff. You could just be like, listen, this guy Hegel is pretty important. And this guy Deleuze, who, is also pretty important, but much later seems to have had a beef with him on some things, like many other Frenchies of that time did. What's going on here? I think that's doable. But again, if your teacher is going to be like, why did you write on this stuff? Then you kind of screwed yourself if you do that. Joseph, how proficient, fluent are you in Latin or Greek? Have you ever had any interest in approaching them as spoken languages, as increasingly more and more have been doing over the past decades? Frankly, I think treating classical Latin and classical Greek as spoken languages is a vanity affectation, and I have no interest in that at all. I'm interested in them as what we call research languages. How proficient, fluent are you in Latin, Greek? Enough to get by. And I mean, here's some things. Every author has their own lexicon and their own style. And so if you're going from Aristotle to Alexander of Aphrodisia, someone in the same tradition, even though they're in the same Aristotelian tradition, there's going to be stuff in Alexander that you're going to have to go to the lexicon for. I kind of think that these things about well, how good are you in this and that are really misplaced. There are classicists who spend their entire time being classicists who can sit down and open up a text and just read it through. But that's because they're encountering an author or a tradition that they've spent lots of time on, and or it's simple writing. Like when you read Descartes in Latin, it's kind of a simple Latin, right? That developed in that time that people did use as a first language in many respects, but it's not the same thing as Cicero. When it comes to these research languages, you learn what you need to learn to be able to read the texts and to not distrust yourself at every moment and to know where you need to go. Like if you are curious about, Greek particles, you go to Denison's Greek Particles, right? If you're unsure about what's happening in this text over here, you go to the Allen and Greenough grammar, or you go to the Smythe grammar, right? And a lot of what you do in terms of that is knowing where to look for things, what lexicon to use. So, but I mean, the idea, I would definitely be totally uninterested in speaking Latin with anybody, which Latin are they going to be speaking? It's not as if there was just classical Latin and ecclesiastical Latin. Those are two big constellations of Latin, but there's all this other stuff too, So I avoid those sorts of things. Let's see. Subcom Freak, I think Schopenhauer gets a bad rep personally. After reading World is Will and Representation instead of the mem stuff on women. Well, so you can say this. Schopenhauer, like so many other philosophers, said a lot of stupid stuff about women that may have been, edgy at the time, but is definitely misogynistic. Does that mean that he's irredeemably misogynistic? No, but it means that he would have some explaining to do. And the question is, does he have adequate resources within his work, as say Aristotle does, to say, oh, wow, I got that wrong. I'd need to rethink that. And it's not just women that Schopenhauer gets wrong. He was wrong about Hegel. He says horrible things about Hegel, and he just comes across as a envious asshole. He didn't help himself out that way. World as Will and Representation is a really cool book. There's interesting stuff in there. Is Schopenhauer underrated? I mean, if you had talked to me about Schopenhauer back when I was in grad school, we basically saw him at that time as sort of like a footnote to Nietzsche. In the last 25 years, Schopenhauer has boomed in popularity. There's lots of people reading, studying, talking about Schopenhauer. So I think he's regained his stature, right? Sean Park says, do you think the amount of well-informed disagreement in philosophy should substantially impact how the activity is done, or should we be more cautious, less confident with our ideas? I don't know how you'd measure any of that. How do you tell what's well-informed disagreement in philosophy per se, as opposed to like in this area? So that seems like a non-starter to me. Let's see what else we have. Miroslav, what are some of the things Foucault gets wrong in his works? So if you're somebody who knows your ancient philosophy and you read Foucault's History of Sexuality, there's points at which you're like rolling your eyes and you're like, oh, come on, Foucault. You're really cherry picking the texts that you're going to, and you're twisting the narrative to get the sort of thing that you want. And Foucault does that, right? Penologists in general are not super impressed with discipline and punish, because there's more possible models out there than what he's talked about. The order of things, I remember being in a Foucault graduate class, and where Foucault says, I'm not a structuralist, right? But then you read the text and you're like, come on, Foucault. What you just described with all this stuff is a Gramscian semantic square coming out of, A.J. Gramsci's work on structural linguistics. And so there's a lot of things like that where you're like, yeah, okay, you got that wrong. His views on the Iranian Revolution were overly optimistic, but so were many other people's at the time, right? And I guess that's probably enough going after Foucault. Nowhere Man, what is extrinsically bad and intrinsically bad? I don't know what you mean by extrinsically and intrinsically in that case. So let's see what else we have here. It just jumped a little bit. Somebody keeps asking questions over and over again, so I'm gonna put them in a timeout and hide them. You only need to ask a question once in these things. And all right, here we go. Let me scroll back up a bit more. Yeah, there's a lot of questions I'm probably not going to get to here. There's a lot of back and forth stuff too. Kademan Klein, what are your opinions on the Hegel versus Deleuze conflict? I don't know what the conflict is, but I always think it's a dumb thing to do to pick team so-and-so, right? These are complex thinkers and texts. Why do we have to be like on one side or the other instead of like saying, well, I think this is good here and this is good here? John Jacques, do you think Nietzsche is a pure philosopher, more of a lyrical, rhetorical one? I don't buy that distinction, so that's a non-starter too. Let's see here. Zeno says there's a lot of philosophy in Cormac McCarthy's works. I'll take your word for that. I've never read Cormac McCarthy. I've only seen movies from that. Lyndon, apart from chalking too many things up to ressentiment, is there anything else you think Nietzsche is off base on? Yeah, I mean, I think that a good person to read on this is Max Scheler, right? He's got that great work on ressentiment, which is a springboard. Nietzsche is wrong about Christianity in many cases, and about Judaism, and some of his prehistory that he's reconstructing. You're like, yeah, I don't think that's really the case. Using the word Chinese, Chinesisch, as a sort of a word of opprobrium. Not really fond of that in his works. There's a lot of places where you're like, come on, Nietzsche, All right, let's see. NOK asks, familiar with any speculative realists? Harman's quadruple object gives things this inner depth, inspiring in a world overdescribed by science. In my impression, and it's a surface impression of the speculative realists, is they're not really doing much new stuff that hasn't been done by others. It's kind of circling around and bringing in some interesting things from Heidegger or Whitehead, but I've met Harman and talked with him, yeah, I think that it's going to be sort of something like radical orthodoxy or a lot of these other movements where 100 years from now we're probably not going to be talking about these thinkers. But I've talked about that many times before. Elijah Miller, do you agree with the theological positions articulated in Moltmann's Theology of Hope and Crucified God? Haven't read him since grad school, so I don't know. Retro Gamer, which are Ursula K. Le Guin's most philosophical works and why? That's a tough one to say because there's so many that are very philosophical, and she also wrote tons and tons of essays. So, The Lathe of Heaven definitely stands out in terms of thinking through how would we improve life here on Earth without introducing all sorts of bad side effects. There's a lot of ideas that run throughout her entire corpus, like her appropriation of Taoism that you see reflected in the Earthsea stuff and in Left-Handed Darkness and in all sorts of other things. I would actually recommend Ethan Mills' recent article. If you just type in Ethan, Mills, Ursula K. Le Guin, it'll pop up. It's in like the Journal of Science Fiction Studies or something like that. The Heinisch novels, there's a lot of really deep exploration of philosophical themes, like in Left-Handed Darkness in particular, about sexuality. So it's hard to say like what would be the most philosophical, right? And the nice thing about Le Guin is you can easily get her books and you can read around and find stuff. Interestingly, she went to high school with Philip K. Dick, and neither of them knew the other one, although later on they corresponded. She didn't want Dick to come and visit her because he was, in her view, a bit of a druggie, and she didn't want that around her family. But they had some correspondence, and she writes about his work in different places. All right. Let's see who else I can take who I haven't done before. Anon Potato, opinions of the rise of Marxism, Leninism in the West. Are you talking about like in the time of Lenin? Are you talking about now where they're a tiny, tiny minority? I don't really have opinions on that, I'd say. Let's see here. Felix, how are you dealing with justifying philosophy as a profession to materialist, pragmatic types of thinkers? Well, pragmatism is a philosophy. So materialism is also a philosophy. You're probably meaning those in a much more non-technical sense. One thing you can do if you're dealing with people like that is you say, hey, do you want people who understand how to use their brains? What do we specialize in philosophy? What are our super skill sets? Ethics, right? We focus on that. Critical thinking, the connections between thought and language, so communications, being able to think about causality, means and ends, all these sorts of things. Philosophy, not in an absolutely direct way, like, just reading a textbook, but in a cumulative way, helps to train people to be better. If you're studying the right kind of philosophy and you're studying it in the right kind of way. If you're doing it in the typical analytic, let's do things in a very abstract way and then like try to knock each other's arguments down, that's of limited utility. I mean, that could be useful if you're needing to enter into agonistic things like that, but it's sure not going to, sort of like the old thing, if you go around carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you're not going to make it with anyone anyhow. And if all you do is like, tell people how they got things wrong, they're going to think you're a prick, and you're going to be missing out on the soft skills. But if you look at like who does best on the LSATs, preparation for law school, is it poli-sci majors? Is it pre-law? Philosophy. There's a reason for that, right? And you can I mean, the real proof is in the pudding. Like, somebody comes to you and they're like, oh, I've got this emotional problem. And you're like, oh, well, the Stoics said this and this and this about it. And then they're like, holy crap, it's magic. A lot of these people who are dismissive of philosophy, when they suddenly find philosophy helping them out, they might change their view. Jason says, hi, Iowa. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe hi from Iowa, which is our neighbor state further west, which is in kind of a rough time these days. Let's see what else we got. Brian says, what would you get out of going through a philosophy college university program that you can't get just by studying on your own? Everything that comes besides studying on your own, I guess, right? What are you studying on your own? Are you going to the local library and finding books, as opposed to like going to a university library, which has much better holdings? Do you learn everything just by sitting in your room and maybe watching videos or listening to podcasts, which you can learn from? Or do you also learn by going to people who know what the hell they're talking about and directly engaging with them in classes and doing assignments and being part of a curriculum and having fellow students? And we could go on and on and on. And you could say, yeah, but I could get some of that stuff on my own without going to college or university. Like, I can do tutorials with Dr. Sadler. Sure, you can do that. And I have some students who, like are out there working and they can't go to school and they do that. But I might not be the best person for studying the stuff that you want to study any more than the person on campus might be. And the idea that you're just going to do it on your own, that works for some people. I learned some areas of philosophy by studying on my own, but it would have been nice to actually have somebody, who's really spent a lot of time with those texts. I'll give you a great example of this. So Schopenhauer, right? Most of what I know about Schopenhauer did not come from my classes because we didn't read any Schopenhauer in any of my classes. I as an undergraduate, I read him on my own. And then in graduate school, I read some more. As a matter of fact, though, I will say World as Will and Representation was on our reading list for prelims for metaphysics and philosophy of religion. So that's why I read it. But when I was a visiting scholar at European graduate school back in the mid-20-teens, one of the perks that they gave me was the chance to take any class I wanted while I was there. And so I looked down the list and I saw that Wolfgang Schirmacher, at that time the president of the school, and also president of the International Schopenhauer Society, was teaching a class, a graduate level class on Schopenhauer. And so I was like, I'm taking that. Right? And we read through parts of World as Will and Representation, parts on the Fourfold Root, some of the stuff about morality. It was a great class. And he introduced me to ideas about Schopenhauer that I hadn't encountered before. And, I was not a slouch in reading. This was when I had been a professor for, 15 years. But getting to study with somebody else is often quite advantageous. So, it really depends on who you're studying with. There is no like across the board answer about this. So much depends on these factors that you have to go into details on. Zeno of Alea, what do you think of Ryan Holiday's Stoicism that can be found on YouTube? I don't watch Ryan Holiday, and frankly, I barely read Ryan Holiday. I just, why would I spend time doing that when I can just go right to the sources? So I'll put it to you this way. As with any other popularizer, if he's leading people beyond himself into actual study of the stuff and leaving him behind, that's awesome. If people take studying with him and buying memento mori coins and stuff like that as real stoicism, that's not good, but we can say that about any other thing too. Braham, what does nature mean for the Stoics? Very complicated question. I have a whole video on that, which you can easily find by Googling Stoics nature Sadler. I'll say this: there was the nature as a totality, and then there's distinctively human nature. And over the development of the Stoic school, they came to recognize that both of these are important. All right, let's see here. Lord Awesome, I had to read Sartre last semester. I came to the conclusion that existentialism would also be practicing bad faith since they still believe that life has meaning. What do you think? I think you've misread Sartre, and you probably need to read more existentialism stuff. Bad faith doesn't just mean thinking that life has a meaning. Existentialists don't think that life doesn't have a meaning. There's a difference between Marcel saying that life is mysterious, Simone de Beauvoir saying that life is ambiguous, Camus saying that it's not life that's absurd, but there is the absurd. So it's not quite so simple as that. And you want to go back and do more reading. Azel, do you view Nietzsche as a nihilist or a thinker working within nihilistic premises? Is there a Nietzsche scholar consensus on it? So answering the first thing, there is no Nietzsche scholar consensus on almost anything. So don't worry about that. Nietzsche scholars are like cats, and herding cats is not easy. Is Nietzsche a nihilist or a thinker working within nihilistic premises? He's neither of those. He sees nihilism as something that has developed culturally over time that is going to be the big problem of the 20th century, the century that he didn't live to see. And he is concerned with diagnosing how nihilism came about, what it is, and then combating it. Now, he's not working on nihilistic premises because that would mean accepting nihilism, right? He doesn't accept it. He thinks it's something that we have to deal with. So, Neil, what is your thumbnail definition of what academic philosophy is and its purposes? I don't have a thumbnail definition. I have a video about that too that you can check out. Sino Kobil, what do you think of Eastern philosophy? First off, I don't call things Eastern philosophy because I think that's an Orientalist perspective. And I think it's also historically quite silly because what we have are cultural fields that, we can talk about Western Europe, which itself is an incredibly heterogeneous field, not exactly the same thing as, ancient Greece and Rome. We've got the whole Islamic world. We've got India and all the things spilling off into places that, are influencing things, say, in China, going further west. We've got the Chinese cultural sphere, which of course is spinning off into Korea and Japan and Southeast Asia. And each of those is its own massive sphere. And to lump them all under Eastern, I think, is trivializing them. I myself have studied and taught Chinese and Indian philosophies in some of my classes. I'm not a scholar on it because I don't read classical Chinese or Pali or Sanskrit or, I don't read Arabic or I wish I even, could read Syriac, but I don't even read that. But, I think that there's a lot of valuable stuff there, and we can do good comparative philosophy when we're not just like doing things in a trivial way and talking about Eastern wisdom or silly stuff like that. I think that if you want, like for example, when I'm teaching business ethics, we talk about there's an article that I have my students read about Confucian attitudes towards rights and how that differs from Western European and Canadian/American viewpoints on things. And there's so much out there that you can't become an expert in all of it. So I have to look to other people. Like when I'm teaching Taoism, I'm reading Graham and his great book on the disputers of the Tao, and I look to Brian Van Norden in the present as somebody who knows what the hell he's talking about, and on and on and on, right? All right, Ryan Teo, how do you reconcile the Stoic notion of meaning and good with existentialism? There isn't a Stoic notion of meaning. That's not a term that you're going to find in Stoic texts. And the good is, as Epictetus says, lies in our faculty of choice and what is inward, right? Stoicism and existentialism both think that we have a lot of input and agency over what we think, feel, do. We don't control the external world as such that we find that imposed upon us. There are some things where the Stoics are going to be on one side and the existentialists are going to be on the other, provided you could actually say what the existentialists say, because it's a pretty diverse group, right? So you have to say whether you're talking about Sartrean existentialism, Heideggerian existentialism, Simone de Beauvoirian existentialism, Camusian, Marcellian, Chestovian, right? You got to be kind of careful with the term existentialism. It's definitely not just Sartre. All right. Nayab Medina, any recommendation about the topic of truth in politics? Well, that goes all the way back to Plato, right? And discussions in the Republic and in the Apology. So I would start with Plato on that. Ridicule, have you read Giovanni? No, it's hard to little letters here. Yevgeny's Zamatin's We that inspired Orwell. I have not. I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. Ryan Lodger, what's your opinion of McLuhan and the philosophy of technology? I think McLuhan was an interesting guy, very prone to, rather black and white thinking about stuff, kind of a originator, but other people were doing better work around that time on the topics. I think the medium is the message has been so overdone, and the notion of hot versus cold things has been so overdone. Most of the people that I meet that are super into McLuhan are kind of culty, and often, they want to make him to be like the important philosopher, and everybody else is kind of like, on the sidelines. Chris Russell, longtime fan of the videos. I'd hate to be that one person. Do you have any thoughts on the author Hermann Hesse? I've only read a few of his works. Probably should read more. I did enjoy him, but I don't have an awful lot to say about him. Oh, it's 1:30 already. All right, so I gotta pick some other things that I can close on, and we're not gonna get to everybody's questions, but here's a good one from Sister Mary Patrick. Are ethics, politics, and rhetoric meant to be read in that order? Absolutely not. Whoever tells you that there's an order that Aristotle's works have to be read in, or that they have a theory about it, is full of crap, or ignorant, or learned that from their professor and never questioned it. First of all, there's two ethics. There is the Nicomachean ethics and the Eudemian ethics. There's also the Magna Moralia, which may or may not be by Aristotle, and the Virtues and Vices, which also may or may not be by Aristotle. So those are the ethical treatises. Then we have the politics, and then we have the art of rhetoric, and we also have the poetics, and we have book 3 of the topics. And those are what we often refer to as the ethical political works, right? And no, you don't read them in any particular order, because you're going to read and reread them over and over and over again. And ideally, you're going to learn to read them in Greek so that you can see when the same term is being used in the politics, but being translated differently in this guy's edition of the politics compared to this person's edition of the Nicomachean Ethics, right? So these are works that all inform each other. Even the metaphysics has some stuff that's pertinent to that. Like you think about book 5, where proiresis is being talked about as a cause, right? And it's being framed not just in terms of like individual decision making, but political decision making. So another one I'll mention too, the De Anima, obviously, right, is germane to these sorts of things because it has to do with philosophy of action. So no, you don't have to read these in any particular order. You read them how you want to. Here's a good follow-up from Chris Russell. Leiter's Guide, the Philosophical Gourmet that we talked about, is a bad idea. Luckily, placement data is available if that's what you're interested in. So what is placement data? If you go to philosophy department's websites, or really any graduate department website, there'll be a thing that talks about the placement of the students. Placement means, where did people get jobs? Where did they go after they graduated? Now, I will say this, a lot of times placement data is inaccurate. The last time I looked at the Southern Illinois placement data for myself, it was like 5 years out of date. And I think I sent an email and I don't think they ever updated it. So, you got to take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, that is a way better way to approach these issues. Let's see if I got anything else that I can go out on. Okay, so here's a good one from Najib. What's your favorite Dostoevsky book? Hands down, the one that's translated either as The Devils or The Possessed. I think that's Dostoevsky's best novel. I like it way better than I like Crime and Punishment or Brothers Karamazov, which are also pretty philosophical. But I think that The Possessed is the most interesting. and from a philosophical perspective, there's the most stuff being put out there that I think is good to focus on and teach and discuss. So, all right, I am going to end there. I didn't get to everybody's question, but I unfortunately never do, as they pile up quicker than I can answer them. But thanks for everybody for joining me and for the interesting and useful points of view and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to sign off here and say have a great rest of the day, or whatever it is where you are.